I'm Josh Davis. We're here with the Genesis Ag podcast today. We've had the pleasure of having my dad, Phillip Davis, owner of Genesis Ag, here with us to talk about going into the 2022 farming season, looking at the increased fertility cost and what we could do as a company to help growers, consumers, anybody on that side of things as far as maintaining profitability, maintaining yield, and keeping things going forward in correlation with some of our products. So glad to have him here with us today. So I guess saying that, what are some outlooks that you have for 2022?
Josh, one of the things that I'm seeing and what I'm hearing and talking with the producers that I'm talking with and hearing what's happening in the industry is we've come out of a very good, profitable harvest season, growing season with the commodity prices that we've been able to capture. And talking with producers, there's quite a bit of uncertainty because guys are trying to get their fertilized tanks filled up. They're trying to get their nitrogen for this coming crop in 2022 purchased. Some guys can find it locally. Some guys are struggling with the supply chain being sufficient enough to meet everybody's needs. But one of the things that's startling is where our price on these input commodities were compared to this time last year. And was talking to a gentleman here the other day, a local farmer, farms quite a bit of ground. And he was paying like 110% more from what he paid last year for nitrogen. He filled up all of his tanks because he said typically he didn't buy that much in the fall, but he's afraid it's not going to be available in the spring. So even though he came out of a good, profitable growing season, he's spending quite a bit of that profit to be sure that he can plant the 2022 crop. So that's what I'm hearing, even on the Mississippi River, all the way up into Minnesota. There's some scarcity of some of these inputs that typically is very abundant. And that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing a lot of uncertainty. I'm hearing that in the tone of the voice of guys I'm talking to, families I'm talking to, of uncertainty of what 2022 is going to bring. And if they can afford to spend as much on inputs in 2022, let me say, afford to spend and use the same volume of inputs that they use in 2021. So that's a concern. They're afraid, okay, if I have to cut back, what's that going to do to my production? If I cut back on my fertility 25%, what's that going to do to my on my bushels per acre? And what's that going to do to my overall profitability? So that's an uncertainty that I'm hearing, Josh, and out here just talking to guys.
I guess it's the same from my side of things as well, of people saying, okay, go ahead and purchase things. But even from a manufacturing standpoint, there have been people that I've talked to, much anybody else, that, yeah, people are willing to sell it, but not a lot of people have it. So let's say that we're used to or have the luxury of putting out 180 pounds of nitrogen for a corn crop. And yeah, after a profitable 2021, we've got the cash flow to do it, people purchasing, and then it may come March of 2022 and there's nothing available based on the current infrastructure that we've got for inputs in agriculture. Where does that leave a consumer that needs X number of pounds of nitrogen to facilitate their crop demands?
Well, you said something there, and I'm going to play off the words that you use. They need a certain amount of these inputs to produce that crop. I'm going to say, I'm going to play off that a little bit And I'm going to say that's a conception of what we have, the amount of inputs that we need to produce that crop. That we have worked with producers where the status quo would be 1 to 1.2 pound of nitrogen to produce a bushel of corn. I don't dispute that. But we have the ability, if our soil is alive and active, for the biology in the soil to produce and actually gather atmospheric nitrogen and make it available to that crop. And where we've been putting that 180, and a guy will say, what do you feel like I could do if I went to 140? I would say, I think with a good sound biological primer that you could stimulate your soil biology, that you could fill in that gap. That would be my response, and spend the same amount of money, but spend it more wisely.
That's the thing that we've looked at with some of our customers over the last few years of efficiency is how can we utilize the fertility applications to maximize yield. And yeah, that first year people may get really nervous about what's going on, but looking at getting a guy to a half pound of applied nitrogen per bushel of corn. Now, yeah, soybeans fix their own nitrogen if they've got the right seed inoculant on it. Peanuts could do the same thing, but let's just say on corn, applied nitrogen is the theory, but looking at 78% of the air that we breathe is actual nitrogen. And then from the fertility that we've applied on our fields, really since the 40s and 50s, whenever nitrogen fertilized really became a hot commodity, we've got a lot of residual nitrogen out there that we aren't or can't utilize based on practice. So the implementation or getting your native biology going is really what we want to look at to create a really good efficiency scheme. So how do you see that applying into your everyday consumer's crop cycle?
Josh, one of the things that I've come to realize working with nature is there's a law out there: for every action, there is a reaction. And that is so true with nature, that we do things to it as producers, and then our ground reacts to those things that we do. And I think we've gotten into a state of agriculture where maybe our soil isn't reacting the way that it did 25 years ago to some of the things we're doing, and we're not getting the response that we got. Yes, we're having some good yields that are being produced, but when back in the time when you were talking about first introducing nitrogen, they could do a lot with a pound of nitrogen at that time because they had a lot more native soil biology versus what we're doing with it today. I'd say the efficiency of the nitrogen that was applied in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the efficiency rating of that far exceeds what we're getting today out of that pound of nitrogen that's applied. Because over this period of time, we saw our native biological activity slow down because we have been force feeding the system, because that's what we've been taught to do. And so now our soil's addicted to what we've been doing. So to move that into a biological world like you're referring to here, there's going to be some steps. And to just go out there and decide I'm going to drop out 50 units of N in 2022 and hope for the best, that's probably not a really good approach. What I would suggest one doing is say, okay, I'm going to drop this 50 units, but I'm going to prime the biology I have, or I'm going to use some other inoculums to build those numbers up so my crop can sustain itself and I'm not going to lose ground. I see 2022 being a great transition year to start transitioning into this biological and to start moving into it because of these outrageously high prices for these inputs.
And I guess one of the biggest things that we try to convey as a message to our customers is it doesn't matter what your fertility load is if you don't have the biology in the soil to create the relationship between the soil and the plant, the fertility exchange can't happen. And looking at a lot of what we do, being mostly biologically friendly, is elevating those levels to create that relationship. That way, efficiency increases, yield potentially increases, profitability potentially increases, and not really looking at the total aspect of, okay, I put out 200 pounds of nitrogen, I expect 200 bushels of corn, because really in a semi-optimal scheme, if you apply 200 pounds of nitrogen the correct way, you should be pushing 300 bushel corn, not 200 bushel corn. Looking at what we're going into for 2022, as far as fertility costs being up well over 100%, seed costs potentially going up, chemistry availability from weed management or insects potentially being a shortcoming, looking at what we can offer through products like Revita N or Morphos or Rhizinate, depending on the respective crop. What do you see from what people have been doing in the past to what they could do implementing some of our products? What do you see as a program or a pathway for someone that could be journeying down the biological pathway?
Well, Josh, with our experience, I really will make this statement, and it may seem rather bold, but I don't think there's a better biological product in the industry today than Revita N. And I would go today head to head with any other manufacturer, any other company in the industry in a 3-year study where we went side by side, same location, whatever it may be. And I really feel like our technology is that far advanced that I don't think that we would have anything to lose, because Revita N is a very balanced biological inoculum. So in what I've experienced and the people that we have worked with, in seeing that with and you mentioned program, I would suggest maybe a half rate of Revita N in furrow, because the closer we can get this biological inoculum to that germinating seed and where it can adhere to that young plant's roots, you're going to be much better off than just a broadcast scenario. So a 16-ounce rate of Revita N in the seed trench. We've talked a little bit about Morphos there. You mentioned it as a phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. We're seeing in our work that we're doing that phosphorus solubilizing bacteria, and it must be the practices that we've been doing over the past 30, 40 years, is we've pushed those aside and they've been waning in the soil, so they've been somewhat depleted. Those numbers have gone down drastically. And so by reintroducing those into a soil profile, we're getting a lot of this calcium phosphate that is bound with that calcium molecule very tightly. We're getting that to release, and we're getting that to become bioavailable to that plant. So by using these two compounds in furrow with, well, of course, again, I will go back, many of our conversations revert back to carbos is the food source for those bacteria. I think that's really the key to making this transition. In my mind, is you've got the phosphorus solubilizing bacteria, you've got your nitrogen fixing bacteria, plus a tremendous host of other beneficial bacteria and fungi in Revita N, and you're putting the food source there with them in furrow. I think that's a ticket for the transition. Josh, there's tremendous benefits with the Revita N and how beneficial that it can be to an acre of dirt.
And the basis of it as well being is every farmer needs to understand that they have a base level of biology, not that the application of biology is saying, well, you don't have it, you need to apply it. But things like Revita N and Morphos supplement their current biology to help them elevate the levels so their soil can recondition from the effects of salt fertilizers, possibly tillage, or a few other things, and saying we can get these things revamped and going again to get to an efficiency state, to get to a yield threshold, and definitely on profitability, because at the end of the day, profitability is what we're taking home. It's not yield, it's not any of these other things. It's plus or minus is what we're looking at.
Yeah, you made a comment there that we do have native biology. Yes, we could not produce a crop without that native biology. And a lot of times we don't really understand what the biology does. It's just like some of the chemistry that we use out there to control things, like whether it be a fungicide or whether it be a herbicide, whatever it may be, is that our soil's biology actually breaks that down. So then it's not toxic to the following crop. So bacteria and fungi are very critical in this whole sequence, because we could put down a herbicide and it might last for 10 years if we did not have this biology out there to break it down. But if we didn't have the biology, then the crop could not produce. So it's a very critical system. I feel like we as producers need to start working with that and understanding that more. And you've alluded to the atmospheric nitrogen. You've alluded to all the nutrients that's in most of our soils across the U.S. And why can't we use that? Why can't we take advantage of that? And everyone says, well, you're going to deplete your soil. But we've done enough testing, Josh, that we're seeing that these levels of phosphorus, these levels of potassium, and there's a tremendous amount of residual nitrogen out there when we do these tests. But we still feel like, well, we've got to put more on. We've got to continue with this vicious cycle that we're in.
That's the biggest thing. We've become dependent on chemical fertilizer, salt fertilizers, any of this stuff to try to chase a dream. And one way or the other, we've not necessarily looked at how to be efficient or profitable within this, because it's been a luxury to purchase these things at the co-op down the street. But looking at going into 2022, that luxury is not there for us because of price, availability, and even application is not going to be there for us next year. So definitely looking at alternatives to meet certain demands. Like you said earlier, we're not arguing that it doesn't take 1 to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen to create a bushel of corn. It's just where you're going to get that from. It's just like 78% of your air that you're breathing currently is nitrogen. So the application of some type of nitrogen fixing bacteria, something similar to what's in Revita N, how much of that nitrogen can we capture? Are we bold enough to say that under the right circumstances, and if the biology is not choked out from chemistry application or salt fertilizer application, that we could fix 25% of crop demands, possibly higher than that if the product's allowed to function. But those are things that are realistic, but you have to understand how that works to say, okay, if I'm shooting for 200 bushel corn, theoretically that's 200 pounds of nitrogen that crop is demanding. Can I do that by commercially applying 120 pounds of nitrogen, which is about the equivalent of what we applied in a 2021 crop to meet our yield goals? Can I do that applying 120 pounds of nitrogen with a product like Revita N? I would say yes, given certain circumstances, could even potentially yield more because of the nitrogen fixation.
I agree with you, Josh, because we've had a number of people that have experienced this. But you keep saying this, and I'm going to agree, is working with your biology and not working against it by doing some harmful and detrimental things to it. And I've said this before in my lifetime. I've been very detrimental to soil biology and some of the things that when I was growing up, I loved to moldboard plow. I really did. I enjoyed it. You're there, you're smelling the earth, and it was just a fun thing to do. But then you realize that, wow, that may have not been that great for the long-term benefit of this farm. But as you're moving through this, one of the most difficult things for an adult to do is to find out something that we were taught early in our life that we've come to believe is the way to do something. One of the biggest adjustments for me has been when I figure out, well, that probably wasn't the right way, but for me to transition to that change, that's been difficult for me at times in my life because you're constantly going back, you're having that flashback. This is what I was taught. This is what I was taught. This is the way I was taught to do it. And I've been around family and whatever. This is the way that we've always done it. This is the way Uncle Bob did it, or whoever it was. Or this is the way grandfather did it, and we're going to do it the same way he did it. And that's not always the best, but grandfather probably did the best he knew to do. And that's the way he was probably shown to do it. And sometimes people are afraid to challenge what status quo is.
We're not at all trying to challenge success in the past. It's just the trend in the industry. We don't have some of the luxuries that even when you were younger and you were farming that you were able to do, like moldboard plowing, and still being successful doing that. Today, that may cost some farmers $30 to $50 an acre to go across the field, where it may have only costed you $5 or $6 to go across the field. We don't have the luxury of the margin that a farmer did 50 years ago. So somebody that has been successful their whole farming life, we're not at all arguing that. It's just the trend in the industry doesn't allow us to have those things that we've always done in the past. So it's a shift of farming practices that we're looking, okay, how can Genesis Ag provide the things? How can we provide a cover crop in a jug, or how could we provide a plow and a disc in a jug over time? Is something like Revita N. I've had a lot of people say Revita N's like a cover crop in a jug. We're helping soil tilt, getting oxygen, water infiltration, a list of things that we're getting out there that we're doing in a jug, that if you went out there and tried to mechanically do it, may be a $40+ investment to pull a chisel plow or a disc or a fill cultivator or put a cover crop in. We're providing that in a jug and looking at a longevity aspect. So in looking forward for 2022 and possibly years to come after 2022, we've done a lot of things since the inception of Genesis Ag 7 to 8 years ago when we first launched this endeavor to do certain things, and looking at a longevity approach, looking at soil biology, potentially reconditioning some soils to do yield goals. Profitability and longevity are what we're really looking at from a company standpoint from Genesis Ag. What are some things for people that have listened to this or looking at products? What are some things that or advice that you could give them to say, how can the farmer ensure that he's going to continue to be farming in 10 years? How could his son continue to farm? How could his grandson continue to farm? What's an outlook like that looking like for what we have to deal with currently in agriculture?
I think with the awareness of we have done things that's been detrimental to our environment, everyone has. And so by putting this
impact on our farmland and things that we have done, I think we're at a point. I think agriculture is at a turning point. And I think the biological buzz is probably going to be one of the things that really saves agriculture. I really do. I think it's going to be able to maintain us into the next 50, 60 years will be the biological movement. And I think it's a great thing. And I think it will help us become better at what we do, because a farmer, we walk over our greatest asset. And that's the land that we manage, we farm. And that is our greatest asset. And so I see us working more with it in the future. I'm really excited about that. These input prices drive more people to the biological avenue. I think it's going to get people window shopping much more and looking at, well, can I do something with a biological product that I've been doing with a purchased commodity? So I would say that if you're looking at the right technologies, there's some good technologies out in the industry. And there's some that are a Me Too product, or they've got the buzz behind them. But I really think this biological avenue will be the way for us to preserve agriculture here in America.
And you alluded to something. There are a ton of companies out there and products that, sure, anybody can generate something. They may not know what they're trying to generate. If they're making it in a tub in their garage or compost or whatever it may be, looking at anything is how they think any biological is a biological. There are very few companies out there that are actually surgically creating a product that can perform in most, if not all, scenarios. And I think till we get more conscious about walking across our fields, feeling what's happening out there, smelling our dirt, seeing how crops are actually growing, to say, okay, I'm missing this. And is that a checklist that we provide from a Genesis Ag standpoint of how many times do you walk across your field and what do you see of things that a product like Revita N can help with: soil tilt, compaction, water infiltration. It's much like if you're 2 to 3 years in to a Revita N program, you shouldn't have water standing in your field 2 to 3 days after a rain, or you shouldn't have those areas in your field where the crop may get weaker. That's one of the things of my first experience with Revita N was going across a field with one of our customers in South Carolina, saying it's consistently, I think it was about 290 bushel, where, yeah, they've had 300 bushel spots in the field, but they had a lot of 200 bushel spots in the field. The product evened the field out. So looking at what can a product bring to your farm, especially looking at a yearly period, is definitely what people need to pay attention to. It's not a dump it in the sprayer or dump it in the planter and take the combine through the field 8 months later. It's what am I actually doing out here?
That's a good point, Josh. We didn't get here in 8 months, and we're not going to get out of it in 8 months. It's going to be a pathway that I feel like in agriculture that we're going to have to choose. I think we choose the degree that we're going to play the game. I think you determine, I'm going to give this a 15% effort, or I'm going to give this a 50% effort, or I'm going to give it a 75% effort, or whatever effort you're wanting to put towards this, and you take a look at it. But again, yeah, I would do my research and find out a really good biological company to tag into that had a really good reputation. And like you said, a really engineered technology to work with that works in multiple locations. I think that would be critical.
Yeah.
I think that would be my first step.
So I think that gives our listeners a lot of points to chat about. So I appreciate having you on the podcast today. And again, I'm Josh Davis here with my dad, Phillip, just hitting on a few points, looking forward for 2022.